UFC fighter Jared Gordon lost to Paddy the Baddy Pimblett from England last weekend in a unanimous but highly controversial decision. In what was probably the biggest UFC fight in Jared's life, many argue that he should have been given the match. Jared was obviously distraught by all three judges going against him, but he won't let that keep him down for too long. Let's dive in and see what's up next for Jared Gordon. First of all, we have Jared Gordon wanting to make a comeback in UFC 286 and his non-Paddy opponent. While it's true that Paddy the Baddy Pimblett's controversial win over Jared Gordon last weekend left him depressed and down, and rightfully so, many people think he was robbed of that win. The American UFC fighter is looking to run it back soon. Gordon wants to have a rematch with the Scouse UFC star at UFC 2, and while it may not be likely for the UFC to agree to the American's demands, it also isn't entirely impossible for the two lightweight fighters to go at each other again soon enough. Though, even if the American House UFC revenge battle doesn't work out, Jared Gordon does have another potential non-Paddy fighter in his sights in the shape of American UFC fighter Tony Ferguson. Jared Gordon even explained in an interview with ESPN why he thinks it makes sense for him and Tony to fight, saying he thinks he still gets a decent fight next after his controversial loss last weekend. He talked about how he had asked his manager to get in touch with Tony Ferguson and arrange a fight between the two fighters. Gordon says it makes more sense for them to fight considering where Tony is in his career right now, and talks about how it would be a big fight for him, one that's high profile at the very least. Looks like Jared is looking to redeem himself, despite many claiming he should have won his fight against Paddy. It's good to see that he isn't letting a controversial loss like that keep him down. Regardless of who he fights, we know it'll be awesome. Up next is the fight with Paddy and the Scouse Pimblett's thoughts on his UFC 282 fight with Jared Gordon. Paddy, in his own defense, talked about how his victory was a unanimous decision, and not even a split decision. He was being honest when he said he thinks that he won the first two rounds, and that he took the third round off. He did say that it's his own fault for taking a round off when he thought he was winning. For most of the round, the British star was trapped between the cage and Jared Gordon, where he struggled for position and traded little blows with him. In the first two rounds, Gordon kept attacking with punches, and there was a pretty clear lesson for Paddy the Baddy in hindsight, to never count on what your perception of what the judges think so far. But regardless of all that, Paddy the Baddy was still firm in his words, and he let the whole world know. The Scouse fighter talked about how fights now are scored based on how much damage is done to each fighter, and who does more of the damage to their opponent. Paddy said the only damage he's suffered was a small cut on the lip, and talked about how he's done more damage in every single round. The Scouse UFC stat said he beat up Jared Gordon's face, busted his nose, gave him a little cut on his head, and even did some damage around his eyes. Either way, the result was given against Gordon, despite many feeling he should have won. But that's all in the past now, even if it was just last weekend. Let's see what's up next for Jared Gordon. Next up, Jared Gordon makes a name for himself with his controversial loss and Tony Ferguson looking to end his losing streak. After his unfortunate loss at UFC 282, Jared actually found himself and his fighting skills being recognized by many, bumping him up in value in the UFC considerably. So much so that it's allowed Gordon to call out for bigger and badder fights now that he's recognized a little more. This all became possible for him after many pundits and most fans gave their own score for the fight between Paddy and Jared, with most of them giving the win to Jared Gordon. His loss against the Scouse UFC fighter may have been disappointing, but it seems like it was actually a blessing in disguise for the future of his UFC career. His fight with Tony just might work who looks to end his ongoing losing streak in the UFC. Tony Ferguson has been on a 5-match losing streak, and we're sure he'll be looking to put an end to it soon. Ever since his loss at UFC 279 to UFC fighter Nate Diaz, Tony Ferguson announced that he's willing to take on lightweight and welterweight fighters now. The last time Ferguson won a match was all the way back in UFC 238, in his fight against Donald Cerrone, a fellow American fighter. Following this win, Tony took on Justin Gaethje for the interim lightweight title at UFC 249, where he lost by getting knocked out in the 5th round. And ever since, Tony Ferguson is yet to win a match. Jared Gordon's fight with Paddy may not look too likely, considering Paddy has more to lose than the American here, but his fight with Tony Ferguson might just work out. Moving on, Jared Gordon calls on his country for the same support British fighters get. Paddy the Baddy Pimblett from England and other British UFC fighters have been getting immense amounts of support from their fans back in England, and ever since before his fight with the Scouse UFC fighter in Las Vegas, Jared Gordon has been reaching out and asking UFC and MMA fans from the USA to give their athletes the same level of support as the British fighters have been getting. The fight between the two MMA fighters may have ended in a very controversial win for Paddy the Baddy, but even before the fight had happened, building up to it saw that most of the attention regarding the match was centered on the British UFC fighter, who's thought to be one of the biggest stars at the UFC right now. At the same time, Jared Gordon saw nowhere near the same level of support and attention that the British man saw, even though he'd been doing really well, winning 4 out of his last 5 matches. And Gordon naturally feels like the UFC fans from the USA should take part of the blame for it. The UFC fighter from the UFC draws a comparison between the love and support he gets against the massive amounts of support Paddy the Baddy Pimblett gets. Let's talk about it. Moving on to Jared Gordon's comparison of support between him and Paddy the Baddy. Jared Gordon talked about the days following up to his skirmish against Paddy the Baddy Pimblett, and how he felt this massive love from fans directed toward the Scouse Warrior, and compared it to the little bit of support he'd been getting. Gordon talked about knowing why he has such little love from fans, and according to him, it's because he's from the USA, while Paddy is from Liverpool in the UK, and has a whole city backing him up for his fights. The American UFC fighter added that the American people love to tear their athletes down instead of showing them some support. He asked who they're even going to stand behind, considering the amount of fighters in the UFC that are from the USA. It's really sad to hear all this from such a competent fighter, and we're sure he's disheartened by the lack of support he feels from his own people. Gordon gave the example of Conor McGregor and how he has his whole country behind him, or how Khabib has all of Russia backing him up. It wasn't easy hearing him talk about how if you're from New York, you can just go self. The American UFC fighter said that that's just how the American people are in their day-to-day lives. There are other fighters too who've questioned the American fans regarding where their support lies. The UFC bantamweight champion from America even talked about how American fans will turn against their own athletes. All Gordon wanted was a little support from his own people, and we hope he gets all the love and support he needs soon. Putting the UFC, the fight, and the lack of support aside though, let's talk a little about how years ago Jared Gordon was close to never seeing the light of day again. Let's dive in. Lastly, we have how Jared Gordon dodged a 25 to life jail sentence. The fighter from America is considered one of the best in the UFC today, competing in the biggest MMA organization the world has ever seen. Jared Gordon just had one of the biggest fights of his career at UFC 282 last weekend, and despite his unfortunate loss, he's looking to the future. But all that might not have been possible if things had gone down differently years ago. Before he was a fighter in the UFC, Jared Gordon was homeless, addicted, and living a difficult life. Luckily, he managed to overcome them, but he did open up about it recently. Jared talked about how he got arrested while he was at Henry Hooft's gym training. He was convicted of breaking into the house of a drug dealer. Gordon was facing a possible life sentence, but somehow managed to get off the hook and eventually turn his life into what it is today. Inspiring. Back when he just turned pro aged around 22, he was training at a gym called Imperial Athletics. He'd opened up with his now wife's friend at the time. The fighter talked about how he got into a little trouble, and less than a week later, the police arrived at the gym to pick him up for a felony battery and home invasion while he was sparring with Michael Johnson. He talked about how the cops arrested him in front of everyone there, and how he was about to face a life sentence. But the person never showed up to testify against Gordon, so he was set free and the case was dismissed. That's when Jared Gordon started to turn his life around, and we all know where he is now. That's a wrap for this video. Who do you think will win if Jared Gordon and Tony Ferguson fight? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.